Welcome everyone. We'll be starting in around a minute's time. In the meantime, if you'd like to take a moment to say hello by putting your name and where you're joining us from in the chat function, and remember to select all panelists and attendees in the drop-down menu next to 2. Okay, welcome everyone to our final CMS In Touch webinar for 2020. I'm absolutely delighted to be inviting Sarah, Patricia, Adia, Martin, Richard, and of course Paul to today's webinar. We've got people from over a dozen countries being represented here today, so thank you for joining us very early in the morning, at lunchtime, in the afternoon, or late in the evening. So we're going to be running for about 2 hours today. If I can just ask you to make sure that if you have any questions to ask the panel, we've got a discussion section at the end. So you can pose questions at any point during the webinar, and please do so using the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screens with 2 little speech marks on it. In the meantime, I'd invite the webinar panel members to put on their videos so you can see them, and I'll pass over to our host for this evening, which is Sarah. Thanks very much, Sarah.
Hello, and thank you all for being here. Particularly thank you to Kat, Fernanda, Eamon, and others in the CMS division for proposing that we do this panel. And especially also to my colleagues, of course, Paul and everybody else for agreeing to put this together. Since capitalism began to dominate our lives hundreds of years ago, people have tried to come up with, have formulated critiques and have tried to come up with proposals for how we should organize ourselves better. And in a moment when critique and transformation matter more than ever, Paul's book contributes to that tradition. Unlike most critics of capitalism, however, Paul works in a business school, even more notably in the US Business School. These are not places usually associated with proposals for radical political economy. Paul's book is also notable because he draws on research from inside large capitalist corporations to identify potentially useful practices for a transformed economy. Making a sustainable, just, and effective economy and society requires all of our ideas, and the panel today is meant to highlight Paul's proposals, but also to add insights from a range of smart people that I'm honored to be with, including you. And many of you have a lot to add to this conversation. You have done it for years. This is just another piece. We've tried to keep our talking time today brief to make sure there's plenty of time for you all to add your voices. And we look forward to a vigorous discussion at the end of the panel. Thank you again for being here.
I think that's a segue into my part of the presentation, perhaps. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm really, as you can imagine, having written a book, to have so many fabulous people offer their thoughts on it and open up a conversation about the challenges and the aspirations we all share. It's very exciting for me, and I greatly appreciate Sarah's effort to pull this together, and the other panelists for their willingness to engage around these ideas. And I'm sure I'm planning on learning a lot from the interaction that we all have moving forward. So let me perhaps switch off that. That would be good. I'm going to share my screen and walk through some PowerPoints. You'll forgive this reliance on archaic 20th century technology, but perhaps it'll make it easier for you to all to follow my presentation. So basically what I wanted to put to you today was some ideas from a book that I wrote, the 99% Economy, it's called, How Democratic Socialism Can Overcome the Crisis of Capitalism. And what I had wanted to do was walk you through 4, maybe 5 key ideas, essentially summarizing for you the assessment of the situation we face as I see it. I don't think we disagreed much there. I offer a diagnosis that capitalism is the root issue and not some other possible diagnoses. A solution, I call it democratic socialism. I think it should be recognizable for most of you, and we can talk a little bit about some implications for practice, or for that matter, for research if we have time. So let me first dive into the assessment. Capitalism's done some good things around the world. I don't think our critique of capitalism will be well received if we can't acknowledge some progress that it's brought with it. But I focus in this book on what I think of as 6 of the more intractable problems that come with the capitalist system: economic irrationality, workplace disempowerment, and so forth. You can read them for yourselves here. And above all, the sense that I think many of us have that it doesn't have to be this way, that where there's enough by way of resources and ingenuity and technology to enable everybody on the planet to lead a decent life. So there's something nutty going on with the way our world is run. Looking out a little further, let me just focus on one of these 6 crises for you, the environmental crisis. This is a projection of what Miami would look like when the surface temperature of the Earth reaches 2 degrees Celsius, which is the projected outcome within a few decades from now. The challenges we face in dealing with the climate crisis, like I said, it's just one of a half a dozen major crisis points that I see as pretty endemic to the social system that we live in. The climate crisis is particularly dangerous. I like this analysis of Kevin Anderson, which has seemed to, even though it was published almost a decade ago now, seems to have been borne out by subsequent scientific research, which is that even as of 10 years ago, we needed to be reducing our CO2 emissions by something of the order of 10 to 20% per year in order to avoid the dangerous outcomes associated with a 1.5 or let alone 2 degrees Celsius increase in surface temperature. He makes the point in this argument, in this article, that in fact, this is way too rosy a picture of the problem, the challenge we face, because once you factor in the likely path of emissions in the poorer countries of the world, in particular China and India, the almost inevitable lag that they would have in reducing their CO2 emissions. What that means is what we call the Annex 1 countries, the countries that signed on to the Kyoto Protocol as richer countries that should be making more of an effort, that are accountable for most of the CO2 already in the atmosphere. They should have reduced their emissions to 0 already. And so clearly that we face a very, very daunting challenge with our climate crisis. And it's a pretty, the magnitude of it is worth keeping in mind. It's not just a question of shifting our primary energy production from fossil fuel to renewables, but a radical transformation of the whole industrial infrastructure. And indeed, in such a transformation, ensuring that millions and billions of people aren't left behind. And so that racial and gender equalities aren't aggravated in the course of this transition is equally dramatic a challenge facing us all. So why do we face this challenge? What's the root cause of these various crises? In my book, I try to explain why I believe they can all be traced back to the capitalist nature of the economic system we live in. The fact that most of the goods and services on which we all rely are generated in a capitalist system. Some of them are generated in the family household world. Some of them are generated by self-sustaining peasant production. Some of them are generated in the public sector. But most of the wealth in society today comes in the form of commodities. A famous man with a big gray beard once said, and that the core of our productive activity across most of the countries of the world, and certainly in the United States, my book focuses on the United States perhaps too much. Most of the wealth is produced by a capitalistic economy characterized by private enterprises that compete for profits, workers who are employees and not cooperative managers of their enterprises, and in which it's these private enterprises producing for profit that generate the bulk of the wealth of society, and government is somewhat separated from that activity. It's not itself running the production of our goods and services. Just to expand a little bit on the two of the elements of the two crises, we began with the environmental crisis. The roots of that in the capitalist system are pretty straightforward. You don't need me, I don't think anyone on this call needs me to explain how capitalist production generates environmental unsustainability and CO2 emissions. The concept of externalities is well enough understood. The other thing that I'd highlight too is the other crisis we face is a crisis of government unresponsiveness. And if we look to the roots of the responsiveness of our national governments, or for that matter, international governments, their unresponsiveness to these various crises, that too, I think, can be traced back to the capitalist core of the economy. Insofar, my argument here is fairly simple and not at all new. It's that it's not, if government is so subservient to business interests, it's not essentially because business has lobbying, invested a lot of effort and money and time in lobbying. It's not just because we have corrupt politicians. It's also because the private enterprise system has an enormous stick at its disposal in the form of a threat to go on strike in its investments, or to flee, take their capital and go into other jurisdictions that are more friendly to their profit aspirations. This all gives capital an enormous, sort of the business community, I should say, enormous structural power over any kind of government, the most well-meaning government in the world, as long as the core of the economy remains capitalistic, is severely constrained in its capacity to deal with any of the big crises we face, in particular, the environmental crisis, since that involves such a massive transformation of our infrastructure. So what's the way forward? What's the solution? I'm all in favor of some move towards social democracy, Nordic style. My argument, however, is that insofar as social democracy represents a more enlightened government, it coexisting with and trying to corral the activities of a private enterprise capitalistic economic system, and I think that's a fair characterization of social democracy, that it's an effort to sort of balance the power of government against the power of the private enterprise capitalist core of the economy. That's a system which can't overcome the challenges we face. The challenges we face, whether it's environmental sustainability, social disintegration, the recurrent economic crises, the disempowerment that people face in the workplace, the international conflicts, these governments coexisting as they must with a private enterprise-based capitalist core cannot overcome the challenges that we face. Desirable as progress towards social democracy might be, it's not going to be progress enough to obviate these, to enable us to overcome these crises. I don't think we have much choice, if we're thinking seriously about how to overcome these crisis tendencies, to go to a more full-blooded form of socialism. And I think our aspirations are well-founded that this needs to be a democratic form of socialism. What does that mean concretely? It means that we need to socialize the ownership of the critical resources in the economy. And then we use our democratic control over those resources to guide the country's economic activity in the directions that are consistent with our shared aspirations, our shared economic, social, environmental goals, setting goals, plans, budgets for the use of those resources, doing that in a democratic way, right? Coordinating this vastly expanded public sector so that it serves the interests of the public, ensuring, I would say, that the control within that sector is as local as possible, but as centralized as necessary to accomplish our goals. And then whatever remains of a private sector, I might well imagine there's a sizable number of private enterprise firms of a modest scale that coexist alongside the bulk of the economy that would be controlled directly by government, and alongside two civil society sectors, all sorts of NGOs and community organizations. The government can play an effective role in orchestrating those activities so that they support our overall aspirations. This is a form of socialism which has not been seen, to the best of my knowledge, anywhere on the planet, by virtue of its democratic commitments. We're talking about a model of society that we would need to invent for ourselves, because the only forms of socialism we've seen are rather authoritarian kind. But the fact that it's never existed doesn't strike me as even a logical reason to argue that it couldn't exist. Nevertheless, the burden is on me to demonstrate how it could be done. And that's where I think we might learn something from these capitalist firms. Many of my friends around CMS have been mystified for a long time by my interest and apparent enthusiasm for some of the practices of these big corporations. And with this book, I took the opportunity to explain to them again why I found those practices so exciting. It's not because these firms give us an image of a socialist enterprise. My argument is different. My argument is that what's happening within these firms is kind of like this sort of socialist strategic management, socialist planning in miniature. And that if we socialize the economic resources of the country, we can use some of the same techniques of strategic management that we see deployed within some of these firms at a much larger scale, at the whole society-wide scale. So this slide sort of lays out the chain of reasoning. Most firms themselves are not composed of little entities put in competition with each other and allowed to compete with each other in an internal marketplace. There's a little bit of that goes on within big firms, but most firms orchestrate a strategic management process to ensure that those units within the firm are all contributing to the overall goals of the firm. And what firms are trying to achieve through that planning process internally is much the same sorts of things as we as socialists want to achieve for the whole economy. And many of the more sophisticated of these firms have developed strategic management techniques, which I think we could grab a hold of and scale up to use to manage the orchestration of our entire society's productive resources in this more planful approach to the way our society pursues its social, environmental, and economic goals. I'm particularly interested in firms that are more advanced in that they try in some way or other to mobilize their workers' efforts and discretionary effort and creativity. Those firms are particularly interesting for me because they see some value in opening up the strategy process and the operational policies to some input from below. So obviously they don't go very far in this direction, right? They can't go very far in this direction because they're capitalist firms. They're constantly hemmed in by the pressures of capitalist competition. But I think if we squint a little bit, we can see in the operation of these firms some principles that give us confidence that we know how to manage vast ensembles of multiple units all working towards some common goals, not with dictating everything that they do from some central headquarters, but as we know, the way strategic management operates in these big firms, identifying the kinds of parameters of performance that need to be set at the higher levels and encouraging local innovation and improvisation in order to achieve those collective goals. Let me be more explicit. I think that capitalist firms within the firm and our socialist society at the aggregate level are trying to do four things and encounter in the process four challenges that are very similar. They try to achieve synergies. They try to maintain innovation, efficiency, and motivation. In our socialist society, we would want the same things. And we would encounter at that bigger scale the very similar challenges that these big firms face internally when they try to manage it within the microcosm of the firm, this strategic management process. You can read for yourself what's on the slide here. I think you get the general idea that the goals are fairly straightforward. And I do think there are rather parallels between the firm in the microcosm and socialist society in the macrocosm, and the challenges they face. I've tried in my book to document similarities in the challenges that we see within firms and the experience of countries like the Soviet Union with their planned economy under authoritarian socialism. It was very visible, it was very clear the nature of the challenges they faced and the parallelism between their challenges and the challenges we see in authoritarian capitalist firms. Some of the better firms, however, have come up with interesting approaches to solving these challenges. Or no, they don't manage to implement them in a very rigorous way, in a very systematic way. For every step forward in implementing these ideas, you typically find a couple of steps backwards. Next time there's some more intensified economic pressure on the firm, or the management team turns over and new more traditional managers step in to replace them. Many of these more innovative approaches to strategic management get undermined, I should say, by the persistence of those capitalist relations. But I do think if we squint a little bit, we can see some very interesting approaches to the resolution of these fundamental challenges of democratic strategic management on a large scale in complex enterprises. I called it participative centralization. So yes, we need some centralized decision-making. That doesn't mean that we can't have lots of bottom-up input to that centralized decision-making. And some of the better firms, I think, show us what that might look like, even if in practice, like I said, doesn't typically work out very well. I'm happy to take some time later on if people are interested to explore innovation, efficiency, or motivation, the elements that I see at work in some of these more advanced firms, and why I think they give us some pretty good ideas as to how we could manage this vast ensemble of public sector organizations in this new socialist democratic system that I have that I have in mind. I should say the version of democratic socialism offering is not in itself all that novel. I do think there's some novelty associated with seeing how we might overcome some of the challenges of socialism through the practices of, through taking inspiration from the practices of some of these firms. Most of the socialists whom I read are not much worried about the difficulties of implementing a planning process on a large, complex scale. And so we tend in our own hearts, to be so enthusiastic about the idea of socialism that we don't give much credence to the critics, whether it's Hayek or any of the other critics of socialism, that tell us that this simply can't work, it's too complex, there's too much dispersed information or whatever. And so we typically don't spend much time trying to articulate how we would overcome the challenges that I identified on the previous slide here, the challenges that the critics of socialism often tell us make socialism inevitably undemocratic or slow in innovation or inefficient or undermining motivation. But I think if we're going to make the case to a wider audience of younger people who are not already committed to this socialist vision, then it's helpful to give them some sort of a vision of how it might work. How the hell would it work to have such a vastly expanded public sector orchestrating the way we meet the needs of society? So that's the main idea. Let me just perhaps wrap up with a couple of thoughts on implications for research, and then we'll turn to some practice perhaps. If you're interested, I thought maybe we could spend some time talking about implications of this view of things for our research. I do think there's some interesting implications for the way organization theory works, which organization theory tends to look for transhistorical truths about organization in general. And I think once we think more specifically about capitalist organization as distinct from the generic problems of organization, we learn some important things. I think a lot of our research as CMS folks is oriented towards a critique of capitalist firms' practices, and I think that's super helpful. I think it's even more helpful if we can grasp some of the internal real contradictions of capitalist management so that we can discern what might be positive and progressive in some of the changes that happen in the management practice. And I do think a commonplace observation in CMS, I think, is that we need to enrich our organization theorizing with some exposure to political economy. I'll pass on these other issues. Let me just turn to implications for research, perhaps. To practice. Sarah was very eager to make sure we got to some discussion about the implications of this way of thinking about things for our practice. I go back to a very old slogan of the sort of socialist left: educate, agitate, organize. Clearly, we've got some important tasks ahead of us in educating both ourselves, and our students. We have much to learn about what socialism means in this day and age in a sort of complex society, riven not just by class structure, but structures of domination of many different kinds. But clearly to our students, I think we, even business schools, we can offer some important sort of make the world more intelligible for them if we explain to them something about capitalism and how it works. With agitation, clearly that's an important part of our lives. Our engagement with these movements, I think, can both improve our own thinking about things, but also we have some things as intellectual workers to offer these movements. For me, the big question in terms of implications for practice are ones that my book doesn't really address. The last chapter of it sketches some concerns I have. I don't think we know how to organize a socialist movement. We had a model of what that looked like in the 20th century, which was essentially a combination of trade unions and a mass social democratic party. Clearly, that's an obsolete model of organization. That is not working anymore. We need to invent something else. The one thing I'm pretty confident of is that horizontalism, which is a pretty common kind of ethos in progressive movements today around the world, that horizontalism is not going to get us where we need to go. We need some capacity to bring together these various movements so that we can act in concert to achieve our goals. But I look forward to any thoughts folks might have as to what that might look like. And of course, we're doing all this in the shadow of the emerging crises of various kinds, economic crisis, but climate crisis, crises of various kinds. And our enemies are organizing to seize the opportunities presented by these crises to assert ever more rigid control over our lives. So on the one hand, I think we face some, these moments of crisis open up new opportunities for us, because those crises can be crucibles in which people's thinking all of a sudden opens up to much more radically novel ways of thinking about the world. But at the same time, those crises are dangerous because they will call for action. And at the moment, the people who are best positioned to seize the opportunity of these crises are our class enemies. Maybe I'll stop there, and thank you so much for listening. I look forward to people's reactions. Thank you.
Great. So now we're going to move on to Richard Marins. And I neglected to mention earlier that we have each of us on the panel is going to have a few minutes to respond to Paul's proposals. He'll get a few minutes after that to counter respond, and then we'll do questions and answers. Thank you. Thank you, Richard.
I'm going to focus on chapter 5 of Paul's book. And Paul's argument there is that there's much to be learned from the best practices of contemporary management. This is a bit of a tall order, given how old management is, how many millennia it can count. And there's always been a tradition of various reforms, reform movements. Even under slave societies, there were reformers who would argue that complete dependence on coercion was not the best way to maximize productivity or whatever. So what can we learn? Well, Paul uses 5 examples. He calls them high road organizations. 2 of them, interestingly enough, largely owe, and in one case totally owe their existence to the nuclear arms race. I'm talking about IBM and CSC. And he points out about how they've been creative in their use of encouraging innovation from trial and error. Now, this is actually part of a very old tradition. I mean, military technology is what, thousands of years old. And military technologists have often been managed in ways that have been creative, have been at least somewhat democratic. And if you read accounts of the Venice Armory, the one at Woolwich, at Springfield, Massachusetts, they weren't managed the way the rest of most of society was. That there was some realization, people were not stupid, that they needed certain amounts of encouragement that weren't available to the ordinary people. And this goes into the 20th century on infinitum. We've got examples, the Manhattan Project, the Sharaskas, in the Gulag even, and any number of American corporations, RCA, Bell Labs, Lockheed, the list is almost endless. I mean, DuPont for sure was started off in gunpowder, World War I, big time, and affected the organization of General Motors. So a very important variable in understanding the historical management of innovation is the role played by the military. And any further discussion, and I realize Paul had a finite number of pages and would certainly agree with me, I'm sure, that he didn't have room to cover such a complex topic in depth. But certainly if there is to be one, this is a variable that has to be considered. I'd also want to point out something about the expression high road. This is a moral judgment. It is not a synonym for whatever, efficiency, effectiveness. And certainly IBM, these 2 companies, cannot in any way, shape, or form be referred to as high road. IBM's treatment of those very employees that were involved in this supposed jam session has been somewhat scandalous. Articles in newspapers, websites, about how they have treated since then a great number of their own technical staff. So I'm not just nitpicking here. I think there's a larger issue. I think there's a part of the Marxist tradition is what I call Whiggish Marxism. I see more Engels than Marx, really. Engels himself was a factory owner, of course, and yeah, codified to a certain extent by G.A. Cohen. And the basic argument, as I see it, is that there are way stations, capitalist organizations on the way to socialism. From what I subscribe to it, in part, I've become skeptical myself over what I've seen over the last couple of decades. But again, I think this is something that requires further discussion. The third example at the other end of the spectrum is Mondragon, which of course is sanctified, and but not everyone loves it. It has its critics. Those don't appear in the book, and those criticisms should be taken seriously. I'm no expert. I don't claim, to have the answer there, but I will point out one thing which is indisputable. It's limited influence. It's about a half century since Oakeshott put it on the map, more or less, with his writings on Catholic social teaching. And it hasn't spread. It hasn't even spread really geographically in Mondragon itself. It built the organization builds factories in other nations. They don't become cooperatives. It buys a large chain of supermarkets in Spain, doesn't turn them into cooperatives. So there are limits here to what we can learn from Mondragon, obviously, and I think those need further examination. Finally, would come to another point here about the other two examples. One is Kaiser, the other one is NUMMI, which was a joint experiment, more or less, that Paul studied. Paul studied both of these, actually, between General Motors and Toyota. And they're part of a tradition, certainly not as old as military technology, but of heavy industry and labor union, typically American in this case, cooperation with management. And this goes back, the steel workers, Scanlon Plan came out of the United Auto Workers, Clint Golden also. So this goes back several decades. Even before that, you can look at Sidney Hillman and the what do you call it, clothing industry. So this has been around for a long time, of finding win-win ways to manage with unions. This is nothing new. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to take. That either the plans are canceled like they were at Xerox, or the firm goes out of business like NUMMI. The example here, basically, just to make the final point here, is that the context needs to be considered. I mean, NUMMI, and I would also add that Kaiser has had strikes, NUMMI has had its critics, and those, should also be considered. But in terms of the political economy of the situation, I like to bring back my friend here that I used the last time we did this. And here's an example. Even if the best case where this works, and, Saturn didn't work, and I can go on and on with this. You have a situation like, you have a sort of what I call a Triceratops effect. Here's the last of the dinosaurs. A miracle of bioengineering. The horns, the shield from bites from you-know-who, an incredible, huge skull on a ball and socket swivel. Great piece of engineering, well designed. When the meteor hit, none of that mattered. The toughest vegan who ever walked the earth went extinct. So I'll close with that because I see my time's up. But I think there's a lot to discuss moving on from chapter 5 is exactly what we can learn and what we can't learn from what's already happened. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. And so now we're going to move to Martin Parker for his contribution. Take it away, Martin.
Thanks very much. I thought when Richard got the dinosaur out that he was going to do some kind of critique of capitalism, because after all, the Jurassic Park films are basically a critique of capitalism, right? Okay, so a couple of things just to start off with. I think that given the magnitude of the environmental and ecological crisis that Paul sketched out, it's kind of incumbent for those on the left or on the green left not to be bickering too much in terms of trying to work out whether they are members of the Judean People's Front or the People's Front of Judea, whatever. I'm more interested in finding common ground, frankly. I think that the debate that Paul is stimulating is certainly an old one, as Richard has been suggesting, but a really important one, and essentially about the role of state-led, of top-down strategies in terms of moving towards a more rational and planned economy. Of course, this has a long history, so the kind of debates that we might have seen between socialists of various different stripes and anarchists and syndicalists and so on very often come down to those questions of strategy, whether it's possible to take the mechanisms of the state and use them in a kind of an entryist way in order to produce some greater social good, or whether those mechanisms are necessarily corrupted and co-opted and consequently best avoided. Now, as I said, in a sense, I don't think it's very productive to think about these things as an either-or strategy. And if you read some of the sort of Marxist critics, Marxians, say Engels criticizing the cooperators or something along those lines, then we get into some kind of political backwaters that really aren't encouraging action. So my remarks are very much in the spirit of encouraging action. So three questions, and they're sort of questions for Paul, but more general questions really, but certainly offered in the spirit of admiration and a positive attempt to use his remarkable book in order to produce some interesting effects. So first of all, there does seem to be a kind of an assumption that large-scale forms of organizing are the best game in town in terms of dealing with a variety of the crises that face us. And I wouldn't want to dismiss that at all. I mean, particularly when we're talking about the environmental crisis, for example, it's very difficult to imagine that without, say, common agreements on something like carbon pricing or taxing aviation fuel or whatever else, that we're not going to get very far with this stuff. So clearly we do need, at a global level, to be thinking about forms of organizing. But at the same time, there's a problem in being too gung-ho about that stuff. And I think it's important to build in a variety of checks and balances, if you like, which deal with the problems of regulatory capture, which after all have been pretty well documented. Any form of state policy is going to require some sort of mechanism of audit and regulation in order to ensure that its attempts at directing human behavior stick. But obviously, certain groups, and particularly large corporations and their interest groups, are pretty good at evading this kind of stuff because they're pretty good at co-opting parts of the state. So we're going to need to think about ways to prevent large-scale organization from essentially co-opting the forms of state policy and administration, which were intended to produce positive outcomes. Secondly, I'm kind of uncomfortable, as Paul knows, with the rather airy dismissal of some of what I would call the kind of post-capitalist alternatives. So the idea of grassroots, bottom-up forms of organizing. It's certainly the case that it's difficult to see these kinds of things scaling very rapidly. Richard made that point about Mondragon and so on. And there's also a kind of a problem in terms of thinking about localism as the solution to everything. I agree. But at the same time, it seems to be unnecessarily exclusive as a strategy to imagine that the state and large-scale forms of organization could deal with all of the kind of problems that we face. The example I've used with Paul previously is, your lovely little cooperative bakery around the corner or something. Is there any particular reason to imagine why that should become part of state ownership? Or do we really need to imagine that all forms of activity are going to be directed and necessarily socialized in some way? And that brings me on to my third point, which is really about, do we need to choose? You know, do we need to choose between large-scale strategies, between the kind of state socialism that Paul is articulating well and honorably, I think, and the forms of post-capitalist grassroots, horizontalism was one of the phrases Paul used, which are articulating a different version of what a movement towards a future might look like, in which case the proliferation of a variety of multiple grassroots initiatives gives us an image of a more resilient and varied and various post-capitalist economy. It seems to me that the real job at the moment is to think about strategies which allow both the bottom up and the top down to be imagined as convergent, rather than basically ending up with a bunch of lefties arguing with each other about the purity of their strategy or its historical indebtedness to some other theorist. And with that, Sarah, I will stop.
Wow, everybody's being very disciplined. Okay, thank you, Martin.
Of course.
Adia?
Great. Thank you so much, first of all, for the invitation to join this really exciting and informative panel. I've really been very engaged with these ideas and certainly have learned a lot from the comments that Paul has made and the discussion that has preceded my comments. So I'd like to not do what sociologists always do, in my view, which is to be kind of the Debbie Downers of a group and offer many of the, but what abouts, and but you haven't talked about, and how do we, et cetera, et cetera. But it's just very hard for me to escape my disciplinary training. So I'm afraid that I will have to fall a bit back into this categorization, but I'm hopeful that we can have a bit of discussion about this at the close of the panel and the presentation. And the issue that stands out to me as one that needs to be addressed and resolved to some degree for some of the really innovative and insightful ideas that Paul has advanced to come to fruition, as someone who focuses on questions that have to do with race in the workplace, I'm really focused on how those issues get resolved in a way that advances some of the strategies that Paul has discussed. And I took note of this in Paul's discussion in focusing on workers as employees in particular. And I want to frame this in the context, and this is a bit American focused, but I think it's important to frame this in this context of some of the demographic shifts that we see happening in the United States. We know, for example, that demographic shifts due to immigration and declining birth rates mean that the US is on track to becoming a nation where the population is increasingly comprised of people of color. And there are debates about whether or not the US is actually hurtling towards this, quote, majority minority standing that many census data researchers have described. Richard Alber in particular takes some issue with this argument and argues that it overlooks some of the rise of multiracial communities and the role of assimilation in their population. But I think we can say, and we do know, that it is safe to say that the population demographics are changing in the US. Latinx communities are now the largest group of color in America. Asian Americans are the fastest growing group of color. So I think it's useful to think about when we talk about these issues of economic change and restructuring, particularly this move to democratic socialism and how that would be implemented, what that means for doing so in a context, in an American context anyway, where we are talking about increasing numbers of racial change and increasing pace of racial change, and what that means for many white Americans who, quite frankly, are unsettled with that change and are unsettled with what the implications of that change are for their position in the US structure and in the US society. So I think about this in particular when we were talking about these issues of economic change, because to me that strikes me as one of the areas where many racial tensions have been borne out. And this has been going on for some time. This isn't a new development. We've seen this in terms of ways in which advancements along the lines of racial progress and racial and economic progress have led to backlash. Carol Anderson, who's an African-American history professor at Emory University, writes about this a lot, and the way in which racial progress has led to what she refers to as white rage and the implications of that rage on a political level. But we also know that if we are talking and thinking about organizations in economic sectors, it's to organizations' benefits, and it's to a capitalist structure's benefit to make sure that there is an emphasis on racial division and racial inequality. W.B. Du Bois wrote about this a long time ago, way more eloquently than I ever could, but his analysis of racial capitalism really underscores the importance of thinking about how capitalism as a structure really benefits from these racial divisions, and how what he referred to as the wages of whiteness put whites in a position where they were far less comfortable thinking of themselves as people who were allied with people of color, and far more comfortable seeing themselves as people who benefited from the privileges that being white conferred in the structure of US society at that time. So I'd encourage us to think about how that's manifested today and what the implications of that are for moving forward in the way that Paul has talked about. One of the things that we know from the existing research is that when we talk about the ways that racial change has advanced or changed organizations, particularly at the present time, one of the things we see is that many organizations, especially of late in the United States, have done a lot to talk about they've done a lot to talk about their affirmation for racial change and the importance of racial advancement. We saw over the summer in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing, many organizations saying that they stood against systemic racism and that they were opposed to it, and blocking out squares on Instagram and so forth to indicate their support and solidarity for racial equity. What we did not see quite as much of were actual movements necessarily to change the leadership structure and the organizational underpinnings that shape those organizations in ways that minimize the contributions of people of color in particularly key roles. I'd also draw our attention to the work of sociologist Jonathan Metzl, who's written a lot about how, again, in the United States, whites support public policies that in some cases they know work to their disadvantage and work to their detriment, but are motivated to do so because of their views about groups of color and their perspective that groups of color don't deserve to have access to some of these public policies. One of the most moving parts of Metzl's work, in my view, is the chapter where he talks about efforts to expand healthcare and how he speaks with and interviews respondents who are themselves in extremely poor health and would benefit concretely and directly in terms of improved health and in some cases longer lives from having more expanded healthcare, but who explicitly say that they're opposed to this because they don't want, quote, illegals and welfare queens to be able to access healthcare through their tax dollars. So I bring up Metzl's work because I think it underscores some of the major issues here and what we're talking about when it comes to this question of this move towards democratic socialism and what it really takes to get to that point. If we know in the United States, at least, that we are at a place where increasing racial diversity and shifting racial demographics are exacerbating some of the long-standing existing racial tensions that have been part of the United States, how then do we move to a point where groups in the structure, particularly white Americans who are often uncomfortable and unsettled and sometimes react very negatively to this encroaching demographic change, how do we move to a point where the framing and the language around these issues isn't so much that they don't want to see other groups be in a position to be able to share benefits to which they see themselves to be solely entitled? How do we move to a framing and a viewpoint where there's a sense that democratic socialism and what it can offer is something that is, at least theoretically, beneficial to and valuable to everyone? And I know I'm running out of time, so I just want to actually close with some insights from Du Bois, who also wrote and talked about this 100 years ago. One of the points that Du Bois has made, and one of the arguments that more recent research is showing, is that emphasis on these ideas of capitalist structures as mechanisms for division and mechanisms for perpetuating inequality may have some utility in helping whites to see the ways in which they are being adversely affected by these types of issues, broadly speaking. But I think it's useful to think a little bit more about how that's manifested and what types of specific structures and initiatives and programming and mobilization would be necessary to really move in this direction. Because again, I don't see how we move towards this process of democratic socialism, despite all of the great arguments that Paul has made, if we're not taking into consideration that there are some really very entrenched opposition to it that's grounded on these ideas of racial divisions and stratification. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Adia. Patricia.
Hi there, everybody. Thank you for having me. It's very nice to actually speak as last, and thank you, Paul, for the book and the presentation. I think my intervention kind of links a little bit what has been said by the other panelists. And let me start with the accolade first, because I think that given the time we are in, it's extremely courageous to write a book and call it Democratic Socialism, and put it out there and promote it and discuss it. Given the negative times and how low politics has gone in the past years, and not only in the US, this is a general comment. I think you show here a certain intellectual courage that is not so diffuse right now. Also of pushing incredibly the debate beyond what we even are able to think right now. So yeah, this is, I think, something we should be aware of. This said, reading the book, it reads to me as a story of like a utopian project in a way. A necessary utopia, because I think the first part of the book where you describe the difficulty of global capitalism basically to sustain life in the longer term is very clear, very accessible. And I think there you are able probably to reach an audience that is quite large, that is not specialized. So that's, I think, the good part of the book. And on the other hand, I do see in the project you propose of democratic socialism kind of the description of mechanisms of governance derived from good practices of large companies that I think are very removed from a political practice of what we are seeing around us today. So for me, what I'm really missing in the book is the process to mobilize today subjects in order to build a political movement from the left to go in the direction that you actually depict. And I think Martin has kind of pointed to the, the importance of the bottom-up. And Adia, to a certain extent, has pointed to the importance of the subject. And precisely in this articulation, in this political articulation of on the one hand, a state project, and on the other hand, what is happening today bottom up. I think that's a very, very crucial political issue that is not really addressed in the book. And I understand every book has its own goal and mission and perspective, but I do think that if this book is to inspire a political action, then we really need to carefully think how it can be used to mobilize, which kind of language do we need to build onto to make subjects that are today embedded in the reality we know kind of envision the dream that you are envisioning and being pulled into that narrative and engage with it and do something with it in their own lives. I do think there is a risk of dismissing capitalism. It's a bit of an ambiguity here, because on the one hand, you derive a lot of lessons from capital. On the other hand, you also dismiss capitalism as a system, and a lot of faith is put into the state. However, there is a lot of political debate about the nature of the state that, of course, kind of questions the possibility that the state is a better alternative to the market. And I'm not only referring here to the historical experience we have with socialism or human kind has with socialism, but also basically the failure of the state, even in social democracies and liberal democracies. I mean, to argue today that the state would do a better job really requires a leap of imagination, because the state is failing so much all over the place, right? And perhaps one last comment about the fact that I actually think we need these large narratives, and in this, you know, I'm reading more and more into post-capitalism and post-capitalist literature, and I do see the limitations of it. But these large narratives, in your case, more a technical, technological kind of large narrative of planning. And in other authors' case, and I'm thinking here of Jody Dean's work, which is much more on like looking at the political mobilization and kind of reproposing the idea of the party as a collective mobilization that is able to actually change institutions, but therefore not emphasizing technology, but rather really the politics and recovering the politics. I see them actually as two complementary kind of large narratives that I think they are absolutely needed, because we need that kind of big project. And at the same time, when I think about how do we mobilize towards those projects, it's still for me a big question mark how this is possible today within a very fragmented world, but also a fragmented identities and the incapacity of individuals to often commit to something bigger than the self over a long time and for a common project. I think I will stop here, and I am looking forward to Paul's answers to these multiple questions from the other panelists and myself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Yes, we'll have Paul here for about 4 or 5 hours. So I'm really glad to be at the end of this group of really probing, insightful commentary. First of all, I want to say I'm so grateful, as Patricia mentioned, I'm so grateful to Paul for making a public and a relatively easy to read statement about political economy in the United States. We have too few of such things. And I'm so glad that he is addressing quite squarely the issue of ownership and property. Again, in the United States, we rarely discuss sort of the justifications for property ownership. And so I am extremely grateful for his contribution to the dialogue. My concern is probably in the lines of Patricia's and Nadia's. It's about not what happens in terms of the economic or the technological or even the initially the administrative pieces. It has to do with what goes on in our heads and our hearts. And I think, as Adi and Patricia eloquently described, the prospects for the success of the kind of project which is being outlined in the book really depends on the willingness of people to adopt different perspectives than those they've been marinating in for their lives. And I say that having last night listened to the debate in Georgia between two candidates for the Senate, and those of you outside the United States You may even know that in the balance of power in Congress depends a lot on what happens in the Senate. And when I was watching the debate between Kelly Loeffler and Reverend Raphael Warnock, every time Loeffler referred to her opponent, Reverend Warnock, she referred to him either as a radical liberal or a socialist, without any reference to what policies or programs he has apparently adopted that would justify that. She used the terms, and socialist I'll focus on here, because she understands that the connotations that they carry for the majority of the public that's listening. Loeffler is, by the way, the richest member of the US Senate, and she made her money in the most scurrilous corners of capitalism. Warnock is a pastor at Martin Luther King's former church, Ebenezer Baptist. She knew she could use the word without any elaboration, again, because of the connotations that it carries in the minds of people in the United States, the word socialist, just as the word capitalist does. And when she was asked about her big fortune and about her selling of stock in an advantageous way on insider information, she talked about the American dream. And that American dream is capitalist, I'm sure she would say. In the United States, capitalist is good, socialist is bad. And the reason this is so glaring is because, particularly in the United States, more so I think than almost any other country, people don't know what they're talking about when they say capitalist or socialist. And this has become increasingly clear to me over the years. I have students graduating with degrees in business who don't understand the basic circuits of capitalism. And I don't mean they can't do a Marxian labor analysis, labor theory analysis. I mean something like what I've drawn on the whiteboard behind me. They don't understand that, businesses are places where people produce profits. Some of that profit's produced by labor, some of it's there's a contribution of capital. They don't understand the system. I have had endless students over the years say, oh, that's how it works. So my point is, if we are going to mobilize the kinds of popular critique of capitalism and support for socialist proposals, I think we as educators need to, and Paul does mention this, we do need to focus on the educational processes that we're involved with and that we can influence. We need to paint a picture of socialism, as Patricia just highlighted, that speaks to people's sense of not only what's possible, but what is desirable, and that a vision that is inclusive in the way that Adia described. We also, however, at the same time, we need to clarify for them what capitalism is. Because again, and going back to Senator Loeffler's reference, capitalism does not just mean good, or it does not mean, as many of my students would say, democracy or freedom, or we have an absence of understanding of how capitalism in fact works. Throughout society, the more privileged we are, the perhaps the less aware we are of how it works. So I think that one of the key pieces that I take away from Paul's book is that it gives us another input that we can use in our educational processes in helping to illuminate for students how capitalism works and its impact. And his book is very good at highlighting the destructive impact of capitalism across a wide range of areas, perhaps most existentially our climate. And then that it does paint a picture, begins to paint a kind of it provides a scaffolding of what an alternative to capitalism could look like. And I think that's those two components are really key in advancing a convincing argument. But I just want to underscore here that most of us here are educators, and I want to call on us to acknowledge, perhaps to a greater degree than we do, the absence of discussion of what capitalism is and how that creates an obstacle to moving past it. And so I think by the way, another piece, and it figures in the diagram I've written behind me, is democracy. And you know, democratic is the other part of the title of Paul's book, Democratic Socialism. And unfortunately, I think in the United States, young people increasingly perhaps or with more severe consequences don't understand what democracy is either. And without understanding what the systems are that we live in, I fear for our ability to move past them. So with that little comment, I will now give the baton back to Paul and ask him to respond thoroughly to each of the 97 issues that was raised in, and we give him the enormous amount of time of about 15 minutes, and then we will open the discussion up to the audience. We have a number of intriguing questions that have been posted, and if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A. Thank you very much. Paul.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, everybody, for such a really stimulating set of issues that you've put on the table for us. I don't want to take that much time responding. I thought maybe what would be more useful would be for me just to try to clear the terrain a little bit to see whether we could put aside some possible misapprehensions about what I was trying to do, and then open up the conversation to the other people on the call. So let me just walk through in sequence what I took to be the main issues that might help us move forward in the discussion. So Richard raises interesting questions about the history of some of these management techniques. I think this is, I always turn to Richard when I'm looking for help in understanding the history of these various management practices, and he's such a rich fount of insight in them. And I'm not sure how they affect my argument, but I'm always delighted to learn more about the military origins of the other sources of some of this thinking. I'm not at all offended to be associated with Engels or let alone G.A. Cohen's early work. That's exactly where I'm at. So thank you for pointing that out to folks. Martin raised, I thought I could summarize Martin's concerns around in 2 points. One is about a phenomenon like regulatory capture that we might well imagine could undermine the effectiveness of this democratic socialist system that I was sketching in the book. I think that's a serious concern, even if these are not capitalist enterprises. We know that the major state enterprises in even the more authoritarian forms of socialism that we've seen on the planet in the 20th century, even in those contexts, the big enterprises, the big powerful ministries exercised inordinate control over what was ostensibly a collegial discussion in the Politburo or wherever about national priorities. So regulatory capture is a real concern. It's also something about which we've learnt a lot. We know a lot through our colleagues who study public administration and public policy, what kinds of mechanisms encourage or discourage regulatory capture. And indeed, regulatory capture has become a very convenient, it was designed from the get-go by Stigler and the University of Chicago people who developed the concept of regulatory capture as a weapon, as an ideological weapon against government regulation, on the idea that we can't ever expect anything worthwhile to come from government, because as soon as government tries to regulate, obviously industry will try to control those regulators, and obviously the self-interest of the regulators will lead them to connive into complicity with those people they're supposed to be regulating. So this is a purely sort of self-affirming hypothesis of regulatory capture. But it's also a real issue, and I do think we know something about how to defend our new system against it. The other question that Martin raised, which I think goes more to the substance of the argument, perhaps again, and Patrizia also, I think, seconded his sense that my story is so exclusively about the role of central government, and I pay very little attention to the bottom-up components of this democratic socialism that I sketch. I do this, to be honest, I do it for a very simple reason. It's not because I don't think those bottom-up local initiatives, the local creativity of smaller scale social enterprises, cooperatives of various kinds, it's not at all because I don't think that energy, that initiative, that creativity is unimportant to a dynamic socialist society. It's because I don't find anybody articulating what it is we want from the central government in the context of such a society. it's very hard. I've not yet, I wrote the book partly because I feel like all the energy and enthusiasm on the socialist left has been invested over the last 20, 30 years in this bottom-up component of what we're trying to do, and too little attention has been paid to the top-down, if you will, the role of central government in this. And unless we see clearly what that central role can be, how it can be democratic, how it can support the emergence of those local initiatives, unless we see how that can happen, then I think we're encouraging people to a vision of socialism which is going to be quite catastrophically impotent. Forgive the sexist formulation of the concept. So we need a way to articulate the role of both components, both the top-down and the bottom-up components, if we want a viable model of socialism. And I just focused the book on the top-down part because that seemed like the missing piece of the equation from where I was sitting. To Adia's concerns about racism, I would add sexism. I mean, these are two debilitating divisions within society that have handicapped the ability of the socialist movement to make progress. I love the reference to Du Bois. I think Du Bois gives us a fabulous way forward in thinking about the role of racial division in sustaining and reproducing capitalism. It's a complicated part of the story. I love Nancy Fraser's analysis of the role of these divisions, sexism and racist divisions in society, and the complexity, the ambiguity, the way in which capitalism both feeds on and reproduces such divisions over time, while at the same time, in some ways, undermining the foundations of that kind of discriminatory, oppressive structure. I think I need more clarity around that complexity. But surely, you're surely right, Adia, that unless we can bring together people across these racial and gender divides, our socialist movement will be impotent there too. Forgive my, again, reference to that metaphor. So yeah, Patrizia, I think, sort of reframed Martin's concerns in an interesting way, sort of asking what kind of imaginary I'm offering people, what kind of a energizing vision of the world to come I'm offering. I can see that my description gets a little dry. I do think in the United States, we have the benefit of one real world referent, which works for some people, perhaps, but not for others. And that's World War II, the economic mobilization on the home front in World War II. I discuss it briefly in my book, and I was struck to see how the way left-wing historiography has shifted in its characterization of the American mobilization for the Second World War. Once upon a time, the left in the United States within the history profession critiqued the Roosevelt administration conduct of the war because it guaranteed profits for private industry for the duration of the war. It suppressed labor militancy. There was a lot of concern about the way the government and big capital suppressed wildcat strikes. I've been intrigued to see the way historiography has turned somewhat and has acknowledged that in many ways the World War II mobilization had a very profoundly democratic content, not just across all kinds of dimensions, not gender and race amongst them, but more generally in terms of worker power. This was an interesting moment where the nation came together to pursue goals and where central government played a productive role, and certainly not suppressing local initiative, but activating local initiative, but towards national goals that were clear and salient to everybody. And the war imagery as a way of galvanizing support for a socialist kind of strategic management of the entire economy has its limits. War is not everybody's favorite activity, to put it mildly, but it does give us, I think, some image of the way a whole society can come together across, with all its complexity, with both a top-down and bottom-up component. So it seemed like there's maybe some juice. I know in the environmental movement, the idea of a World War II style mobilization against climate change, that's baked into the formulation of the American Green New Deal. It's a reference point for some of our European colleagues thinking about the European New Deal too. That's an image that perhaps may resonate for some people. And then just a couple of thoughts on Sarah's observation. yes, I think our responsibilities as educators are really should be an important part of our discussion moving forward. Socialism, of course, in the US has a mixed sort of history here. Clearly, folks who have firsthand experience from Venezuela or Cuba, we've discovered in Florida they were rather easily swayed to vote Republican by reference to the socialist character of the Biden administration to come. But for most Americans, I think we could do I think we've got a good shot at convincing that socialism is a brilliant idea. If everything to the left of the Tea Party Republicans should be considered socialism, which is essentially what the Trump administration and the Tea Party type supporters of Trump have argued, that Obama was a socialist, Clinton was a socialist, Biden is a socialist, they're all damn socialists. I think we can get 3/4 of America on board if we put our shoulder to the wheel with the idea of that socialism, we want a lot more of it. So I'm not sure that label socialism is such a handicap. I did find in writing the book, lots of friends encouraged me to stay away from the label. And I have an open mind. Maybe we do need a new name for what it is we're trying to accomplish. I don't think post-capitalism does much for us because it's not a positive statement. It's just a statement of what it's not. So we need some positive way of stating it. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to me socialism was actually a pretty good label for what we're looking for. It's got its limitations, but it's also got a long lineage of noble struggles that we do want people to connect with eventually. So I'm down with socialism. As for capitalism, yes, I love the work that Sarah's been doing in trying to get people to think harder about the salience of capitalism as a construct to help us make sense of the society we live in. I love it in particular, I have to say, and then with this I'll conclude my comment. I love it in particular because so much of the left critique of the status quo has been framed as a critique of neoliberal capitalism, of American-style, shareholder-oriented capitalism. Damn that, no, the problem is not neoliberal capitalism. Our big problem is capitalism as such, whether it's in neoliberal form or less, austerian form. That our social democratic friends have completely failed to offer any compelling vision beyond they've been completely colonized by third way thinking for the last 40, 50 years. They've been incapable of responding to the crises of capitalism. So no, it's capitalism that's the problem, and we need to keep that in focus too. So let me stop there, and I look forward to hearing other people's points of view on all of this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Paul. We have a number of fascinating questions in the chat. I'm going in the question and answer. And again, if you have something that you would like to, if you have a question or a comment that you would like to share with Paul or any of us, please put it into the Q&A. That way we can keep track of them. So back a while ago, Andre raised the question, how does your conceptualization of democratic socialism differ from the German economic model of a social market economy? So I think that's addressed specifically to you, Paul, perhaps? Do you want to comment on that?
Sure, I can't say I know enough about Germany and the social market model, but I think of it as a variant of classic social democracy, where for the main part you've got a government trying to uphold the public's needs, and it tries to make its peace with a capitalist private enterprise economic core that's producing the goods and services on which the society depends. So yes, there's all sorts of scope for regulation. There's all sorts of scope for cooperation, cross-sector cooperation. But in the face of the pressures that I identify across those 6 major crisis points, I don't see German social democracy, even in its very best years, as having cracked any of these problems, because I think structurally it's incapable of it. Capitalism is incapable of overcoming recurrent economic and financial crises. It's incapable of making the kinds of energetic changes we need to turn our fossil fuel-based economy into a sustainable economy. Very nice to see that Germany's turned away more or less from coal, nuclear, good, but we are so far away from any vision in Germany or any other capitalist country from the kind of transformation we would need to make our societies environmentally sustainable that I don't see, I'm all for moving in these directions. Coming from the United States, any of this looks like progress. Don't get me wrong. I just don't think that this is progress anywhere near deep enough, far enough to overcome the big crises we face.
Great. Thank you very much. We had another question, which is about the role of the significance of the internationalism and the possibility of socialism in one country. And this is from Alessandro. Which role does the fragmentation of the globe in different polities have? How does that impact this? So let me open that up to any of our panelists and see, would somebody besides Paul like to weigh in on international alliances around the project? Okay, Martin, thank you.
I'll have a stab. I mean, I think it's a really interesting issue. And again, it kind of, it points up what to me are quite important questions of kind of scale, federalism, top down, bottom up, and all the rest of it again, doesn't it? So it's all very well talking about the possibilities of forms of state organization within one country. And even maybe about squaring kind of, let's say, top-down and bottom-up strategies within that particular state. But as soon as we start thinking about scaling up in order to address the big climate challenges that face us, or indeed other questions like resource shortages or transnational migration or whatever else, then we're necessarily thinking about forms of federalism which are much bigger again, forms of agreement which are much bigger again. And I find it a little difficult to imagine that happening effectively at from a grassroots level, but at the same time, a sort of a vision of some sort of global parliament or something like that does sound a tad unlikely to achieve. So I think, I mean, for me, it's going back to these kind of questions about organization, which obviously is something that a bunch of us claim to know something about, in terms of what are the most appropriate forms of organization to deal with particular kinds of problems. And I guess, part of my pitch, my response to Paul is that, don't put all your eggs in one basket, in a sense. State socialism might be one strategy for dealing with certain kinds of things. It might not be the best strategy for dealing with, say, internationalism.
Yeah, just on
Paul, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, maybe just to add something. I do think our ability to imagine international governance is so severely handicapped by our sort of everyday assumption that international affairs are going to be guided by the interests of each country's business sector. The reality is it's the big corporations that dominate trade negotiations. It's the big corporations that undermine the Paris Accords on climate. It's the big corporations that have, and their interests that are being advanced by each country's government, defending their own capitalist class against competitors from other countries. That element, that sort of economic nationalist element, has not disappeared just because some businesses have globalized and are now indifferent as to whether they produce in China, Ireland, or the United States or Mexico. That sort of economic nationalism is a powerful factor fragmenting the international agencies that we should be relying on to coordinate our action, and make it very hard, to imagine an international parliament. But why wouldn't there be an international parliament? Let's talk about CO2 emissions and how and what kind of allocation of emissions and what international aid will flow from the rich countries to the poorer countries to help them overcome this climate crisis. So yeah, I think the international dimension of this is hugely important. In my book, I had the luxury of ignoring it in large measure, although it's one of my 6 crises. I didn't spend much time on it just because I was writing, as you can see, as soon as you open the book, I was writing mainly for an American audience, and America is a big enough player on the international stage that we could implement socialism on within one country. We are not so dependent on inputs and imports that we couldn't do what the hell we wanted within the United States territory in large measure. And That's on the one side. And on the other side, were we to make a breakthrough towards a more humane form of social society, that could be massively inspiring for people all around the world and greatly facilitate the task of progressives in other countries, just because of the terribly repressive role that the US plays in the international, through the international finance mechanisms and all its domination of the UN Security Council and all the rest of it. So I had the luxury of not paying enough attention to this international dimension in the book, but I think it's a very central issue. So thank you for raising it.
If you run for global president in 4 years' time, I will vote for you, Paul.
Good. We're recording this for his political ads. Okay, so there was a Patricia, did you want to say something?
Perhaps we haven't mentioned COVID-19 yet, and I thought, oh, we're missing something, right? So I thought that actually we are at a time where the role of the state is becoming more present, right? So I think we are at the juncture, and we have an political opportunity here to make some statements about how we envision more role for the state. And Mariana Mazzucato, for example, is very present in public debates, kind of advocating for recognizing and giving back the role to the state. And okay, we don't know yet how to organize it globally. Okay, you cannot solve everything all at once. But I do think we are at the historical moment where the limits of so-called neoliberal capitalism are becoming more visible for a bigger audience. And that's an opportunity, a political opportunity. I'll just stop here.
Great. Yes, thank you for adding that. There were a couple of questions which addressed an aspect of the book that Paul himself called attention to, his use of the enlightened corporations and the ways that they can provide insights into organizing an alternative economy. Richard, would you address some of that? I think you touched on it earlier, but maybe you can expand a little. You need to unmute.
Yes, it would help if other people can hear me. The one thing I'd say about their books like When Corporations Rule the World, I see the corporations a bit epiphenomenal here, that particularly in the US, more than I think anywhere else, where corporations relative to government played such a huge domestic role for so many years, there was a tendency to look perhaps not enough behind the curtain. And so you have a whole tradition here of thinkers from Veblen down to Mill, certainly Burley Means, who saw what you might call the Mamlukization of America, where the professionals who ran corporations or had supplied important technical information and innovation would more or less take things over, and the rich would clip their coupons. It implied a stability that was somewhat illusory, I think. And I'm certainly not the first person to notice this. Sweezy's comments on Burley Means, Zeitlin is another example of people who, au contraire, the ruling class is alive and well, and it's not merely, in the executive suite. Of course, some of it would be, and increasingly so in the 80s. Origi's argument that once production is no longer profitable, too many cheap imitators around the world, finance has a tendency to take over. And we've certainly seen this in the US, certainly in our business schools, where finance people run everything. And the point I'm making here is that corporations come and go. Business organization comes and go. But there's something more fundamental. And well, we can learn from anybody. I mean, it doesn't have to be corporations, it can be churches, it can be armies, about how people are organized. I don't think that an excessive focus on corporations, it tends to obscure as much as it illuminates. I'll leave it at that. Paul, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. And that's well put, Richard. And I agree with you completely. Well, Almost. I don't know that it is obscure so much as illuminates, but I think it does. It illuminates, but it can also obscure. It can, first of all, it obscures real lessons about large-scale, sort of managing large-scale, collaborative, complex enterprises that we can learn from places like Mondragon. You're quite right, Mondragon, the model hasn't diffused, but that doesn't mean there aren't important lessons to be learned about a form of society in which cooperation becomes the organizing principle. Secondly, my focus on these corporations and the way they orchestrate large-scale collaboration, I'm not spending any time studying the rich history of such collaborations in the public sector, right? We have vast public sector enterprises that have taken huge hits as a result of the accumulation of neoliberal kind of attack. But many of them have rich lessons for how to manage in a socialist world. Yes, this is a point Patrizia, I think, was referring to. Yes, these big public agencies are agencies of a capitalist state. They carry some capitalist features, albeit in a less marked way, perhaps, than the private enterprise enterprises do. But, and we shouldn't be oblivious to the way in which their management systems, internal management systems, are shaped by the capitalist character of the society in which they're embedded. But again, there's important lessons, and arguably more important lessons that could be learned from a focus on public administration than private administration. The counter argument, I think, is interesting. The counter argument is that given the various pressures on public agencies embedded in a capitalist society, they spend a lot of time navigating these conflicting priorities, and that were we in our socialist society clear about our public priorities, we would perhaps bring to bear, we would find useful these management tools that capitalist firms have found, because their tasks are much simpler too than the public enterprise, a post office or whatever. So I'm open to learning from any of these sectors. I chose to focus on the corporate sector because I knew more about it, because if you want to make an argument for socialism in the American context, to tell people that these capitalist firms have shown us how it can be done, that's an easy win for rhetorically. And I do think theoretically, as you perhaps know, my reading of Marx tells me that these firms do develop new managerial techniques, a bit like they develop new technologies in order to support their own profitability, but yielding ideas and tools and technologies and techniques which a social society could take over, reorient, adapt for the socialist context. But this is a precious legacy that I think we can take forward with us into socialism.
Several questions raise issues of identity, gender, race, disability, related intersectionalities, and we've been addressing a little bit the limits of the political limits in the United States. Adia, would you like to weigh in on what you think are sort of the most powerful levers for shifting the limitations that that we seem to not be able to avoid?
Sure, thank you. That's a great question. Also, I should tell you my name is actually pronounced Adia, not Adia. That's okay. I don't think we had a chance to do our own introductions earlier, so no problem. Yes, so when it comes to addressing these kinds of issues and ways of thinking about how to get past some of the problems, I think it's harder to point to historic or existing models of what has worked because we have so many examples of what has not worked, right? I mean, there's such a long history in the United States of what I think of as missed opportunities, as places where, or moments in time and cruxes in time where as a nation, we had an opportunity when it comes specifically to racial issues or to gender issues to address and reset and move into a direction that could have resolved these issues or done more in terms of creating more progress, and ultimately ended up failing on those issues, right? If we look at the period after the Civil War, obviously that was an opportunity where the US failed and had an opportunity to really grapple with and reckon with its past and chose to instead double down on white supremacy and inequality and continue the subordinate status of people of color in the nation. The civil rights movement represented another opportunity where the US had potential for really moving forward and driving home reforms that were structural in nature and addressed ways that race intersected with poverty and class and inequality. Again, the ball was kind of dropped, right? There's this long history in the US of 2 steps forward to take 1 step back, particularly when it comes to these racial issues. So I think, as I was saying before, it's difficult for me to envision how we have a discussion about restructuring capitalism into democratic socialism without also being mindful of and attuned to how these issues of race, of gender, nationality and citizenship, sexual identity are also bound into those issues, because they all play a role in perpetuating capitalist structures in ways that are usually very disadvantageous to those groups in question who are marginalized in certain ways. What I do think the existing research and existing history does tell us, though, is that if we want to move past kind of where we have been in previous eras and we want to stop repeating the mistakes of the past, it's necessary to take a different and much more forthright and intentional approach, right? So we know, for example, in the aftermath of one of the most recent eras of racial justice, the civil rights era, we know that one consequence of that was that reforms and measures were put into place to address explicit, overt racial discrimination, racial inequality. And we had that in the Civil Rights Act. We have some evidence of that in the Voting Rights Act and so forth. Obviously, that was great. That was very important and it was necessary. What those kinds of reforms did not do were that they were not designed, again, to link those issues to these broader economic and capitalist structures. They also were not designed to address or foresee the ways in which shifts on racial issues could restructure themselves into what sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva refers to as colorblind racism, right? Or as he describes it in his book, how there are manifestations of racism without racists, where these same practices of racial inequality continue to persist and perpetuate, but they do so in ways that aren't addressed and were not envisioned by models that focused only on explicit forms and ideas of racial inequality. So all that to say, if we are going to think about how these issues have to be resolved in a current moment, I think it's necessary for us to do what we haven't done for a lot of US racial history, which is to talk explicitly about what it means to face these racial issues head on. And I think there are applicable aspects of this argument for gender as well. Paul brought this up in his response. And I think there are some ways in which there are parallels to gender, but also some differences. In the interest of time, I know I don't have time to go into both, but I do think that we have to think about how we can address racial issues directly and head on. And that means, in my view, not simply thinking that they are going to be solved by moving to a focus on class-based issues or capitalist issues, right? Often I think that's what comes out of this unwillingness to directly address these issues, is that we think, well, we'll solve these issues of capitalism and then things fall into line. We'll move to this democratic socialist platform and then that'll resolve these racial issues because we'll solve the economic ones. But we know that those things are related but not synonymous, right? And we won't resolve racial issues. We have not resolved racial issues by focusing on things that are related to but distinct from race. It has to be a focus on those issues directly and in a full-throated and full frontal fashion. What that actually looks like, I think, is probably more of a discussion than we have time for today, though.
Yes. Thank you very much. Paul, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Oh, just that I'm so grateful that Adia's brought these themes into the conversation, because I think it's pretty inspiring, the kind of creative, lucid thinking that we've had in the women's movement, or the socialist feminine, the various currents of socialist feminism, have just fabulously rich resources for thinking about these issues. That label socialist feminism went out of fashion a couple of decades ago, I'm told, but the reality of it is just as real, and the richness of that body of thought and writing is still there. And within the African-American community, the depth of thinking about socialism, the engagement with the Communist Party in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, the depth of radicalism and radical thinking about what role race plays in in the socialist movement, how to overcome racial divisions. You know, these are fabulously rich resources for the socialist movement moving forward. So it's not like we're beginning from scratch here. You know, this is not like, oh, a conundrum. What do we do about racial and gender differences as we move forward in socialism? These are issues that have been with the socialist movement forever, and we have a rich body of thinking that can help us orient ourselves in this context, going back to Du Bois and others. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Martin, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to spin the discussion sort of towards the future, I suppose, really. So, I mean, one of the interesting things that Paul was just nodding towards there is the idea, of course, that any formulation of utopia falls down if it can't cope with history. Yeah, so you get, you know, a whole bunch of writings about utopianism as if they were a kind of almost kind of detached from their conditions of possibility, a version of what the future might look like. But as Adler and Patricia, I think, were clearly articulating, you know, one of the most difficult problems that we deal with, and you know, I don't know if this is a familiar phrase in other places, is the idea of a just transition. Yeah, in other words, you know, to move towards, say, a zero carbon, a more diverse and more inclusive society, and so on. In order to do that in a way that somehow recognizes the gigantic historical inequalities, whether we're talking about gender or ethnicity or whatever else, is a really tricky political balancing act, isn't it? Because in part it involves pitting very well-founded and historically literate identity politics against versions of a kind of an ahistorical future. And you're going to need to be a pretty smart politician to achieve the kind of just transition that both reckons with the past and articulates a vision of a future that we can all share.
Thank you very much. There was a question which I think sort of segues from that. There were a couple of questions in the Q&A that addressed the political moment that the United States is in, and I think one of the fundamental observations, and it's reflected in that vignette that I described from the Senate debate last night, is that we are encountering, those of us who are in the United States, we are encountering a deployment of the most stark statements of opposition, denigration, exploitation, et cetera, that have been under the surface a little bit, not always under the surface, but have been kind of operated with a little bit of a veneer of which has been just sort of crudely dragged off. And I think that's part of what we're seeing with the mobilizations from the Black Lives Matter movements, from the youth support for socialism and questioning of capitalism, which I would say, just in reference to my previous statement, that even I think those young people who are supposedly embracing socialism really aren't clear what it is that socialism is, and they're also really not clear what capitalism is. They're really just objecting to the status quo. But I guess my point is, I think we are seeing this kind of heightened reactionary atmosphere, which has sort of the benefit of revealing the narratives that have been so important for holding up the status quo. And I have no idea which direction that goes, whether that leads to that greater sort of transparency about how we operate leads to reform or even more radicals, or whether we just grind into each other. I don't know if anybody else who observes US politics wants to weigh in on that.
I'll just say something briefly. I grew up, I'm old enough to have grown up at a time when I was bottom half of the middle class. And we were up at the time, I'm talking about the 1960s, we were the most prosperous, lower middle class in the world, probably. And, we complained a lot, but there was a sort of background optimism that things get better over time. And to see the kind of, one thing I mentioned, the NUMMI. NUMMI is now owned by Tesla, run by a man who makes George Pullman look like Robert Owen. I mean, this was not supposed to happen. I mean, so I'm at a loss to know whether this is like the crisis that is necessary, like a reaction to a vaccine is to cure you, or it's just the rolling down the hill. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think we're in a strange place, but I don't think it's specific to the United States. Across Western Europe and the United States, just to talk about the rich countries of the global north, Japan too, you've had economic stagnation for virtually 50 years. If family incomes have grown, my understanding is it's almost entirely a function of the growing prevalence of two earners in the family. And so I think we call that exploitation. If you've got to have two people in the family to live like once upon a time you were able to live with one earner in the family, that's a doubling of the rate of exploitation. Dang. But the reality is people have had it miserably, have been miserable. They get really angry when they think that their kids are going to have a worse life than they. And that brings out a lot of anger in people. And if there aren't progressive forces out there offering them a better vision of the future, then they'll turn to any xenophobic racist moron, even if he's an idiot who's failed 7 businesses in a row. So people are desperate, and our social democrat friends in Europe, the established social democratic parties there, the Democratic Party of the United States, have failed utterly to offer people any reason for confidence that there's a better, brighter future ahead. And so people are desperate, and they'll turn, and a lot of young people turn to this thing they're calling socialism. As Sarah said, they don't know quite what they mean by it, but they know it's something that radically has to change, and then on the other side, you've got a lot of people who just turn racist and xenophobic. So yeah, it's a dangerous moment. And in the United States, I think Europe too, the rise of China challenging American hegemony has made that turn, that sort of the renewal of any path to prosperity that much more difficult. But yes, this is a really difficult conjuncture. I think that's right.
May I add a comment? Do we have time?
Please, yes.
So I was just going to say, Sarah, I found your comments really insightful during the presentation, and I want to echo some of the comments that people have made here. I would just add that I think there are 2 things when we talk about the failure of many people's understanding of what socialism actually is and what it does and what it means has a lot of historical precedent, but I think it also has interesting generational implications. And I say it has a lot of historical precedent. I thought about that when you were talking about the Georgia Senate race in particular. I grew up in the South, and I lived in Georgia for over 10 years. And it's a place that has a very particular history of that accusation in particular being levied towards people of color, Black people in particular, who are fighting for more equitability, not only along racial lines, but along economic lines in particular. That's a long-standing term that gets used as an epithet, often in many cases, regardless of whether people are explicitly making claims that have to do with economic equality or not. It's become linked with these ideas of racial equity in certain places in the South, where people like Raphael Warnock, who's running for the Senate, who comes from this tradition of Black liberation theology, which makes these points about drawing from religious history and readings for more racial equity, becomes shorthanded into socialism because it threatened the status quo of the South, particularly in a pre-civil rights era. So there's a long history of that terminology being used without a lot of reflexivity and without a lot of thought, and even without a lot of evidence of what that actually connects to when it comes to economic analysis. The interesting implications for the future, in my view, are generational, because I think the data indicate that we see that millennials are a lot more likely to embrace some sort of openness or receptivity to socialism than many of their generational forebears. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that millennials have found themselves in a really awful situation. They've had to endure 2 recessions at this point, severe ones, by my count. They've had to deal with the increasing costs of college education, much bleaker job market. And I think that those structural frustrations that they often didn't create, but find themselves in the crux of having to react to and respond to and to try to navigate, have put them in a position where they are much less likely to be reflexively resistant to the implications of socialism if what they think socialism means is that they have access to healthcare that's not going to bankrupt them, or they have access to clean air that's not necessarily going to poison them, or that they have access to jobs that are going to pay a certain amount of a living wage. I think that creates a very different view, generationally speaking, for younger people, again, who are part of a more multiracial generation and part of a more multiracial group than their predecessors, who may have been more likely to use the term socialism as a scary epithet against people who simply wanted to be able to vote in peace without being shot or mauled by police.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. A lot there. And I think that highlights, one thing that it highlights is the importance of calling out what is capitalism, and what is not, that what are the roots, what are the causes of the problems that you are facing, that your generation is facing, and naming it and giving people the tools to be able to identify that and separate that out from anti-immigrant, et cetera, racialized hatred, et cetera. I know we're about to end. I just wanted to give Martin a chance to address just the climate,
Yeah,
just climate change, Martin.
Okay, quick on climate, but it's picking up on what Adler was saying as well. So, that sense of a generation whose experience has been shaped by a whole bunch of shocks, but also most recently of the kind of relatively transient, but nonetheless very transient, but deep shock of COVID as a kind of dress rehearsal thinking about the climate crisis. So many of the students I teach, the climate crisis is front and center. They've been taught about this, since their first day in school, and the image of the last polar bear dying on the last iceberg and so on is ingrained into their memories with 100 Richard Attenborough documentaries. And I think this could be quite crucial. This could be really important in terms of thinking about the legitimacy of collective action. That's all.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, I think I'm conscious of the time. I think we are going to end. And I just want to extend again my deep gratitude to Paul for, as Patricia said, the courageous act of writing this book. And I think it goes without saying that any criticisms or calling attention to things you didn't say are tiny compared with our admiration for the project that you've taken on and the contribution that you've made to public discourse. And I just want to underscore again your comment in your initial presentation about how you hope this has an influence on, or these issues have an influence on academic research, because that is, that's our wheelhouse. So I'm very grateful to Paul, and then I'm very grateful to our panelists, and it's been wonderful. Some of you I've known for a while, some of you are new to work with, and it's been a pleasure interacting with you and hearing your voices, and I look forward to future conversations and collaborations. And finally, just thank you so much to CMS for organizing the In Touch series. I think it was a brilliant idea, and Kat has just been extraordinary in holding our hand as we got through this and put it together. So I'm really grateful, and I'll turn it over to you now. Thanks, Kat.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thank you to all the panel, to Sarah, to Patricia, to Adia, to Martin, to Richard, and to Paul for such a wonderful conversation. Just to let you know before we finish up, I've put some links in the chat, so that's to our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to watch this webinar and all the other webinars in the series so far. So if you are feeling wanting to be inspired over the Christmas break, you can kind of tune into them rather than any kind of films that are being shown on television at the time. And finally, to say thank you so much to the CMS In Touch team. I think I get a lot of undue credit for this because I'm literally the marionette that comes in and talks tops and tails the webinars, but we've got Alex, Arturo, Ozan and Vegeta in the background who do so much work to help put this series together. So thanks so much for supporting us this year. We've had over 1,000 people from across 22 countries join us live and on YouTube and all our webinars. And we've got the next event, which is in January the 28th, called Speaking a Different Language, Challenging the Patriarchy Through Forms of Communication. You can register for that already on our Eventbrite webpage, and the links in the chat. In the meantime, I wish you all a safe and happy holidays, and thanks again to Sarah and the team for joining us. Thank you.
dark, spooky.
So Richard, are only the two of us? Richard?
I'm here, Patricia.
Yeah, okay.
I'm here too.
I'm
Hello?
here as well.
We are all